We're looking at these various mechanisms that we use in order to ensure that the information we are extracting out of the Torah is accurate. In other words, making sure we're getting the right end of the stick. Because otherwise, I mean, honestly, if you engage with people, the things that they dig out of a verse in the Torah they're insane. And probably one of the most common areas where you find this is people trying to defend, based on scripture, their theology that clearly does not fit with scripture. So until you know these methods, how do you fact check?
Sorry, Rabbi, other than this, have you heard Charlie Kirk arguing with people at university, the things they say about
Okay, but it's a whole different concept.
It's actually mind-boggling what they say.
Fine. But so that's a whole different concept. I'm saying over here, somebody who claims that they are reading the scriptures, how do you know if they're reading it correctly? And by the way, you can bring this very, very close to home. There were religious Christians in this country who used scriptural references to rationalize apartheid. It says it in the Bible, and this is how it is, right? So if you don't have a fact-checking method, then how do you know that what you're extracting out of the scriptures is actually authentic?
The South African legal team proved that we must kill everyone like Haman, like Amalek. When they argued that
But again, I come back to the same point. I come back to the same point. The point is, how do we know when we're extracting information out of the Torah? How do we know we're doing it correctly? So these are the mechanisms that we use. So far we've discussed Kal Vachomer, which is a logical mechanism. So it's not necessarily so clearly based on the verse, although you're using the verse to produce the Kal Vachomer. Gezerah Shava, which is completely based on a verse, because a Gezerah Shava is looking for a word that's an anchor in one verse and linking it to the same word in a different verse and creating the cross referencing between them. And then we ended off last week talking about Hekesh, which is where the Torah juxtaposes things in a particular context, and that allows us the opportunity to learn from one subject to the other. We're now going to introduce ourselves to a principle called binyan of. Okay, now this is not as simple as people think. And some of these are not as simple as people think. Binyan of is an expression, welcome back. Binyan of is an expression that means to build an of. Okay, what's an of? No, but he doesn't have the new one.
Charlie, he has a new one.
Do you have the new one? Oh, you have it? Okay, okay, fine. So what is binyan of? What is an of? Let's start there. Okay, what is an of?
The head of our family.
What is an of? Okay, so far you've said two things that are accurate. You said that an av is a father, and you said that an av is the head of a family. What on earth does that have to do with learning?
I don't know.
So are you familiar with any halachic area that speaks about an av? Thank you. The melachos of Shabbos. There are 39 voice melachos. There are 39 categories of forbidden activities that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. And then we say that under each category, under each heading, under each of, there will be, what do we call them? Toldos, which are subcategories. Okay? Now that tells you a lot about what binyan of is supposed to mean. I need to create a principle, and then there will be many scenarios or examples or details within or under the heading of that principle. Right? Binyan of, how do I build a principle? Now, if you have a look in the Gemara, you are not generally going to find in the Gemara the expression binyan of. Even though that's the mechanism that we're using, the Gemara will say kal v'chomer, or what's the alternative? We learned there's an alternative. Instead of kal v'chomer, din. Din, correct. Right? So the Gemara will use those words. The Gemara will say the din is X and Y. Or the Gemara will say kal v'chomer. Or the Gemara will say gezerah shava. Or the Gemara will say makish, which is the word hekesh. But when it comes to a binyan of, the Gemara is not going to use those words. So what's the Gemara going to use? The Gemara is going to use an expression called me motzinu. Me matzinu. Okay? Number 4. Oh, sorry.
Almost.
Okay. So, me matzinu. You're obviously very late. I realized. Okay. So, me matzinu. What does me matzinu mean? Come on, what does the word matzah mean? Matzah. Huh? No, okay, that's with a hey. Right? That's true. That's matzah. Matzah. That's matzah. This is matzah. What is matzah? And it's spelled with an aleph at the end. What does it mean? Matzah. Moitze. Metzia. Different metzia. Right? What's matzah? Find. To find. Me matzinu. What do we find? So that's the phrase that the Gemara is going to use. Me matzinu means, what about this case do we find that we could use to build a principle? In other words, the analysis is going to be, how do I understand this case? What are the factors of this case? What are the unique elements of this case? And based on those unique elements, boine av. And sometimes the Gemara will say, ze bona av. Sometimes we'll say that. Ze bona av. What?
It's not a bridge. It's not like building a bridge.
No, building a category. I'm building a category. Hekesh builds a bridge. Now I'm building a category, bona av. I'm trying to build a whole category. And then that category is going to affect other areas of Jewish law. Now, how do you create a category? And how do you identify what belongs in the category? So what the Gemara is going to illustrate to us is that there are times where the Torah will use an expression with some information, so that in future, any time that expression is used, that information will apply.
Not like first time in Torah.
No, not necessarily. And by the way, first time is not a guarantee of a precedent.
That's news.
Okay? So what are we looking for? We're looking for where the Torah added information to a particular topic. It might be the first time it appears. And then it does so in such a way that ze bona of, this now creates a category or a definition that we can now hyperlink to every other time that example is used.
It's not Masorah, you can see it in the words.
No, it has to be Masorah. You can't invent it.
No, but you can recognize it in the words. I mean, the limited amount.
Because Shav you can also recognize in the words, but you have to have a tradition. So let's use an example. The Torah talks about various animals that you bring as sacrifices. So there's certain specific species of animals that you bring as sacrifices. Depending on what animal it is and depending on what sacrifice it is, will determine what age it has to be. So the same species of animal could be referred to sometimes in more than one way. For example, you have something called an aze. What's an aze? A goat. No, Azazel is something else. Well, even though there is that is the association with something else. So an aze is a goat. Okay? An aze is a goat. What's another name for a goat? Seir. A seir is a goat, very often referred to as seir izim. But you want to talk about Azazel, we talk about the seir la Azazel, the goat that goes to Azazel. And you can even use the word gedi. There's chadgadya. Gedi is a kid. So now the question is, what's the difference between an aze and a seir? They're both words for a goat. So the very first time that we come across the word aze in the context of sacrifices, we're told aze bas shenosa. An aze, a she-goat of 1 year old. Ze bono of, so the Gemara says this now constructs a category. The category is that any time in the Torah that you see aze, it's a yearling, as they call it. It's a 1 year old animal.
Why is it? How does it jump to that conclusion?
Again, you can't jump to the conclusion. There has to be tradition. You have to know that this is the way to interpret the verse. And therefore, if you did not have this information, you would not know how to interpret the verse.
The Gemara will say
That's
Zeh bin Anav or Zeh.
No, we'll say Mem Atzinu. What do we find?
Right, but you know that's bin Anav when it says.
Correct. So on occasion, we'll say Zeh Bona Av. That thus builds a category. And on occasion, it will just say Mem Atzinu. What do we find in this case? X and Y. Likewise in other cases. Now, Mem Atzinu could be a lot more complicated, as we're about to discover. It's much easier for us if the Gemara says straight out, Zeh Bona Av. The fact that this time the word A's is connected to Ben Shenasah, that it's Ben Shenasah, that it has to be one year old. Zeh Bona Av, and now I know that that's the category. But Mem Atzinu is more complicated than that. One second, let's just work out a Mem Atzinu. Okay? Mem Atzinu means this. You ready for this?
I don't know.
Okay?
Yeah.
You ready for this?
You've lost me.
We're not actually ready, but
Okay, so let's go through it.
No one's ready for what we're about to get.
Mem Atzinu means that one of the methods that we use, and it's exactly what fits under this category of what we call a binyan av, one of the methods that you use anytime, any logical process that a person uses, is to find common denominators between different topics, because if you find the common denominator, you could use that as a means of comparing the two topics. Okay, that's not a, you know what this reminds me of, like in the old days when you were learning factorization.
Hey, what's going
Right?
on?
So, you know, as long as you know how to find that common x, you know, then you can translate across. You can replace x with whatever the value is, and you can work out the whole equation that way. So that is what we call a tzad hashaveh. Okay? Tzad hashaveh, the direct translation of tzad hashaveh is tzad means a side, shaveh means equal. So what side, what aspect, what angle of these two things is equal? In our language, we call that the common denominator.
Oh,
Okay. So what's the Gemara now going to do?
I was going to say mina b'haim and mina b'haim.
Well, so let's just finish the principle first. Okay? Let's just finish the principle first. So the Gemara is going to say this. We want to know what is the law in this particular case. So the Gemara will say, Me Motzinu, what do we know already about another case that shares certain similarities? We know this information about that particular case. So what we're going to do is, we're going to try and compare the two and see if there is a tzad hashaveh, if there's something common between the two. Now, you cannot just pick some arbitrary common denominator and based on that, try and establish a whole legal principle. That doesn't make any sense. So for example, just to use an example, let's say I'd walk into the room and say, Dion is a kohen. Dion shaves his head. From here we learn that all people with shaved head are kohanim. That would be ridiculous.
Or that Shalom shaves his head.
No,
He's a left-hander.
no,
That's
no, that's not an halachic principle. That's just a statement about a person.
No,
We
because
are looking.
all
We're
kinds-
looking to establish an halachic principle. So if I look at the sample and extract information about the sample and say that information now is the indicator of a law. So what's the common denominator? Guy with a shaved head, tzad hashaveh, that's a common denominator. He's a kohen, so he's also a kohen. That would be a stretch. That would be a major stretch,
I was
right?
saying the same thing as a stretch. In other words,
No, but you were saying an establishment of you as a person. We're saying establishment of a rule, binyan of. We want to establish a principle, a rule that will apply across multiple examples. Anytime I plug in guy with a shaved head equals kohen, right? X equals kohen, right? That would be ridiculous. You can't do that. You can't extrapolate some loose piece of information that happens to link two scenarios and say, therefore, all the legal application of that scenario is now applied to this scenario. That would be crazy, right? So what do we have to do to find a tzad hashaveh? What we're going to do is, me motzinu, what similarities do we find between these cases? Me motzinu. So maybe we find the Kohen example is not an easy example, right? Because what are we going to find in an individual Kohen that would be reflective of what a Kohen is? That would be ridiculous. You can't look at a person and extrapolate out of a person's life what the laws are, right? So, no, because that's a word. We're not. That was the first example. The first example is a word in the Torah. And we're saying that the word in the Torah is introduced, so every subsequent time it no longer tells us the age. Why did it tell us the age the first time? To set the tone of the halacha going forward. But here we're taking a different approach of a binyan of, where the binyan of is not built on wording in scripture. The binyan of is built on seeing the similarities between two cases in order to carry crossover between the two cases. So 1 second. So let's first do the principle. And then we can look for an example. So the principle says this: Me motzinu. What do I know about this scenario? I know these facts. What are those facts are? Okay, so let's use an example that's not a real example. It's not a real example, but let's just use an example that perhaps we could relate to. Let's say that the halacha is that if a person is impure because they had tzoras, let's just say. So now they're in a state of impurity. So me motzinu, what do we know about tzoras? We know that if a person has tzoras, then they have to stay outside of the city. They have to be in quarantine. We know that they have to announce themselves to other people to protect other people from becoming impure. We know that they can only become pure again once somebody has examined them to ensure that the tzaras is cleared up. And we know that there's a ritual they have to go through in order to purify themselves, which includes shaving and bringing a sacrifice and going to the mikveh. It's a whole process. So that's what we know about a person who has tzaras. So me motzinu. What information do we have about tzaras? These are the things that we have. And then we're trying to learn what are the rules when a person is in a different scenario of impurity. So what's a different scenario of impurity? What's that? I'm saying a different scenario of tamei. A different kind of tamei. So I don't want to use something as extreme as tumas meis, because we all know that's extreme. So let's try something that's not as extreme as tumas meis. Let's say, what happens if somebody is tamei from what we call zav? Zav is a scenario where a person has an illness. Zav is a situation where a person has an illness. As a result of that illness, they have this unusual seminal discharge. And as a result, it leaves them in a state of impurity. Okay? So what do we know about a zav? We know that a zav is impure for a period of time. And we know that a zav is somebody who can transmit that impurity in ways that even somebody with tzaras cannot. For example, if they sit on a chair, then somebody else could become impure from sitting on that chair, which a zav could not transmit necessarily. Okay? And we know that they purify by going through a mikveh and bringing a certain korban as well. So, me matzin, what do we find in common between the two? We find that in both scenarios, they can transmit impurity. We find that in both scenarios, they have to bring a sacrifice in order to purify themselves. We know that in both scenarios, the nature of their impurity is that it's something that came about from a biological process that happened in their own body, as opposed to the dead, right, exposure to a dead body. This is something that happened within their own body. It's just that biological process is tzaras, and this biological process is zav, but they're both biological processes. And we know that they are both forbidden, for example, to go into the Beis Hamikdash. Let's just say. So now we're going to say, well, maybe just like the person with tzaras has to announce himself and warn people that I'm impure and I could contaminate you, maybe the zav also has to. This is where I'm looking for the binyan of.
But you got to say no chance on that.
What? Why no chance?
There's no chance.
Why no chance?
Could you imagine?
But that's your issue, that it feels uncomfortable. That's not a legal issue. You can't decide legal concepts based on what makes a person feel uncomfortable.
Am I wrong?
Absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
Absolutely wrong. I'm just saying, you cannot decide a halacha because it's going to make somebody feel uncomfortable. So we've now matched up a whole lot of common denominators. So we want to say binyan of. maybe every person who is impure has to announce that they're impure, which, by the way, there's a whole argument for that in halacha. That any person who is impure has to let other people know that they're impure so that they don't contaminate them.
So they have to say what it is.
We're not getting into that level of conversation yet. We're not getting into that level of conversation. Now, we're trying to establish a binyan of. We can spend the whole night discussing other things around this.
I don't get why you infer that you have to tell somebody as opposed to not tell somebody.
Okay,
Why
so
not use
again,
the Zav
as the standard, because the Torah tells us clearly, in the case of the Metzora, the Tomei Yikra, that he has to announce that he's impure. So now we have something. Again, how did we learn it the last time? How did we do the binyan of the last time? The Torah told us explicitly in the case of A's that it's bas shnosa, that it has to be a year old. So we used those words and we said, oh, those words are establishing how we determine the age of every single A's goat sacrifice that's called A's throughout the whole Torah. So we want to say the same thing here. The Torah says in the case, because the Torah will not give us all the information again in every single case if there's a possibility that the cases could reflect on each other. So seeing as the Torah says in the case of tzaras, Tomei Yikra, that he has to announce his impurity, maybe that's telling us that that's the rule for all kinds of impurity.
Hold on, you've got a few categories that you can, a few synonym, it's not the right word, that are correct on each side, right? This one, they both got 1, 2, 3. Then you've got the one where he has to announce, right, which is not on the other side. You're now trying to infer that because we've established now this binyan of, everything for the one now has got to go across to the other.
No, did not say that.
No, I'm just saying like...
No, I'm not saying, I'm absolutely not saying that. I'm saying that piece of information that the Torah specified in the case of tzaras, that you have to announce your impurity, if I match up a whole lot of commonalities between different types of impurity, then that piece of information that was added there might be a binyan of for all cases of impurity. Not that all the laws transmit. Not that all the laws transmit. This principle, Tomei Yikra, which the Torah added in the case of tzaras, was it only for the case of tzaras? Or if I can plug in, because there's a bunch of similarities, other cases of impurity, then that idea of announcing your impurity has to be carried, because it's binyan of, maybe it's now established as the rule of all cases of impurity.
I'm saying the same thing.
No, you were saying all the issues of impurity.
Anyone, you're just using one of them. I'm saying pick another one.
Can't pick another one. This one, the Torah specifically...
Why did the Torah say that for both of
They
them?
just said it for the one. They didn't say
Whoa. One at a time.
No, it's very frustrating.
Why didn't the Torah say that for that type of contamination he must announce as well?
Because the Torah does not repeat information in every scenario.
Yeah.
If you could say it once and it's binyan of, it could apply to all scenarios. So I need to identify now. When the Torah, in the case of Torah, said you have to announce your impurity, was it establishing a category of impurity that across, or a rule of impurity that across all impurities you have to announce? Or was it just saying it in the context of Torah? That's what I've got to work out right now.
Isn't it?
That's what I've got to work
Well,
out.
if it is, then yes. If it isn't, then no.
What do you mean if it is, then yes? I have to work it out.
A binyan of across to another.
I have to work out, is it a binyan of, or is it not a binyan of?
But you've got some. So you've got.
This is why I said at the beginning, let me go through the whole scenario first, because if we don't go through the whole scenario, then we come with all the side questions and you lose the sense of the scenario. So what's happening over here? What's happening is you've got a binyan, you're trying to establish a binyan of. We're trying to identify. There are two scenarios of impurity. In the one scenario of impurity, we're taught that this particular category of person, unequivocally, everybody agrees, has to announce the impurity because the Torah says so. When the Torah said it, did it mean only in that case, or did it mean in other cases of impurity? So now I start shopping, or I start searching for links. So I say, the Tzoras person, do they contaminate other people? Yes. The Zov, do they contaminate other people? Yes. Common denominator, Tzad HaShaveh. The person with Tzoras, do they have to wait a period of time before they can become pure again? Yes. Does the Zov have to wait a period of time? Yes. Common denominator. Okay? Then I say, in order to become pure, do they have to immerse in a mikveh? Yes. In order to become pure, do they have to immerse in a mikveh? Yes. 3 points of commonality. Number 4, Does the Matzorah have to bring a sacrifice as part of the purification? Yes. Does a Zav have to also? Yes. Another point of common denominator. As far as I'm concerned, me'ematzinu, what do we find? In the case of a Matzorah, he has to announce his impurity. Likewise, in the Zav, and possibly other scenarios of impurity, he has to announce his impurity. Asks the Gemara, hang on a second. There are things also that are not common. For example, what?
Would that be an escafta?
No, it's just the building of the whole concept of binyanav, right? And so I'm still in the analysis of the binyanav. When I land and say binyanav yes or no, then I could see if I'm going to question. Let me just try to finish the whole system first, and then we're going to take all the other questions. Okay? So now we've got a whole bunch of points of commonality, and I want to make the leap to say if they're common, then the Torah, by adding the additional words in the case of Tzaras, Tamei, Yikra, that you have to announce your impurity, then Bana of, that establishes a rule that any scenario of impurity that shares common denominators also has to announce their impurity. Says the Gemara, but who says they're common? Why? Because what's unusual about a Zav is that they can be Matame, Mishkav, or Moishav. Which means that if in fact the one that's actually the big thing about a Zav is Merkav, but whatever, that a Zav, if he rides a donkey, the saddle can now transmit impurity. And that's not something that happens to a Matzorah. So now maybe they're not common after all. And then the Gemara will have to work out and eventually land at this point. The Gemara will eventually say, Loi re'i zeh ki re'i zeh. The two cases are not identical. Each one of them has something that doesn't reflect in the other. But hatzad hashove shebohen, but I can still identify a number of common denominators, and because those areas are common denominators, therefore I can conclude binyan of that you learn this principle, announce your impurity across the board. Now this is a scenario that I just made up, by the way. It's not right. It's not an exact. Tzad hashove is slash binyan of in the Torah.
It's got a unique item.
So I need to be able to prove if this one has an outlier aspect and that one has an outlier aspect, that's fine. We can ignore those if there's enough commonality between them and then create a opinion of.
And the rest are, there are three commonalities and one outsider.
Yes, so what you'd have to find is you'd have to find something unique on this side and something unique on that side. So then you could say, and the common areas are the link. It's no specific amount. It just has to be compelling. So it has to make sense. You can't find one stray commonality and say that you're now linked. There have to be a number of commonalities, and so typically those commonalities will speak to like core issues,
and
right?
It can apply to different. So like 3 or 4 different.
Usually it's 2. Usually comparing 2. Usually it's comparing 2 when you're making a binyan of, unless it's a binyan of based on words that could apply in all of those scenarios. And you can say, well, the words tell me that the binyan of carries across all the various scenarios.
So, what was the question before they started this discussion? Were they trying to say that this type of impurity also has to be announced? How did this come about?
Yes. That's exactly what it would be. I'm identifying language in the Torah that is unique to this case. Does that mean that this language only belongs in this case? Or is the Torah using this as a launch pad to tell me about a whole lot of similar cases that this piece of information has to apply?
Do they argue yes or no whether it's been enough or not?
So you'd go through the whole process, and then you'd come to your conclusion, and then the Gemara has the option of debating, well, maybe there's a reason to discredit that whole conclusion.
This is actually an outlier principle. You can't make up in Avia, like in the example you gave.
I don't know if that would be the angle that you'd come from. The angle would have to illustrate that there's less commonality than you're illustrating. Or more diverse elements that you haven't listed.
How about you might think this is a commonality, but in actual fact it's not?
You could. It's not so likely that you'll be able to do that, because once the Gemara is presenting something as common, chances are it's pretty common.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying it's out of the question that you could use.
Is this a technique to understand more?
This is a technique to understand how the Torah can be efficient in communicating halachic principles without having to repeat itself again and again and again and again. And I need to know how to pull out that principle and know where it applies.
All of these all affect that.
Yeah. Yeah.
All opinion of no.
Yeah, at this point, but they're not like a Gzera Shava where either you received it from your teacher or not. Binyanov, there's an element of logic that you can prove with it. Right, the Gzera Shava you have to take on faith that we were taught that this word links to this word. Binyanov, you can corroborate. You can say, well, look, here are the similarities. This is how it links up. This is why it's logical to make the connection. Okay, quite a thing, right?
Follow me and you got it right. It's a bit complicated.
Okay, so that's quite a mechanism, and the I don't know if you want to say the unfortunate thing, the whole Mematzinu and Tzad HaShavah, etc., does not appear in Gemara that frequently compared to some of the others. But when it does, people get completely knocked off their perch because they don't understand what's going on over here. Like, what are you actually doing? What are you saying? This is similar, that's not similar, whatever. If you don't understand the principle, it just looks like mush. So it's valuable at least to understand that the principle exists. When we hit it in real life, in an actual Gemara, you're going to have to say, well, just remind me how this whole thing works. Because it can be quite tricky.
So can you do all the Gemaras that have these, if you want?
Well, I mean, it would be like really chopping and jumping and whatever.
Do you have an actual example of a good binyan?
Of a good binyan. Either it's a binyan or it's not a binyan. I have one on the tip of my tongue, and I just I can't formulate it offhand, to be honest. Okay.
It's not good enough for you.
Let's go further.
I want proof.
Let's go further. So.
No, you're not paying attention or what?
No, I got it.
Somehow not
There'll be a test.
saying lots,
There'll be a test after.
just made up.
Yeah, I mean, there's elements of it that are based in. So it's based on a true story.
It's not true.
All right. Let's get to the next one, which is going to be beyond what we have the scope to conclude this evening, I think, and that is the different interactions between klal and prat. Okay, there are various interactions between klal and prat, and just when you think that you've worked it out, we'll go to the next category, which is ribuy and miut. So just when you thought you understood klal or prat, then you're going to get the next one that's going to like really rock the boat a little bit. Now, klal or prat, before we can get into any of the details, let's just understand firstly what the words mean. So what is the word klal?
Well, that's general.
General, right? And what is the word prat?
The opposite.
Specific. Okay, so klal is general and prat is specific. Okay, so let's use an example. What would happen if I said, everybody here has to prepare this piece of Gemara for next week?
Wait.
To be
No one.
to be very obvious who I'm referring to, right? I'm referring to everyone because that's a klal. Klal is everyone, and everyone obviously includes everyone.
Refer to yourself.
So now, if I said prat would be, Shalom, you need to prepare this piece of Gemara for next week. That would be prat. That'd be specific.
Katzen, for example.
Okay? So, simple, right? Klal is the general principle. Prat is the specific. Great. Easy. Now, how the Torah presents something when it's using a general reference and then a specific reference could teach us a whole bunch of things. Here are various options. Option number one, I make a general statement and then I give a specific example. That's one possibility. So for example, I say, you're not allowed to work on Shabbos. That means that you're not allowed to cook or write or carry. Let's say I did that. So I've first given you the general principle, which is you may not work on Shabbos. And then I've given specific examples. You've got to ask yourself, why did you do that?
It doesn't sound right.
But let's just think, why did you do that? One scenario. Next scenario, the reverse. The reverse is, you may not light a fire on Shabbos. In fact, you can't work at all on Shabbos. Now, at face value, I've done the same thing in different ways. Halachically, I've done two very different things. Okay? So you have to ask yourself, if the Torah first presents us with a generic rule and then a specific rule, you have to ask yourself why. Whereas if the Torah first gave a specific example and then extrapolated out to the general rule, you have to ask yourself why.
Often does it both.
1 second. Those are the first two scenarios. Okay? Those are the first two scenarios. Let's get to the next scenario. Next scenario is klal uprat uklal. Now what the Torah has done is it's given us a general principle, then specified an example or a detail, and then gone back to the general principle. Okay? Now you've got to ask yourself, well, why did you do that? Why did you make a general statement, then list off specifics, and then again tell me the general statement?
The same general statement.
Same. Might not be identical words, but it's the same principle. Same general principle. So let's say, for argument's sake, I said, you may not work on Shabbos. And that means that you may not write on Shabbos. And you may not cook on Shabbos. Because you may not work on Shabbos. So why have I done that? What am I emphasizing over here? Right?
How important it is.
Okay? And then there's the other possibility, which is I give a specific example, then I tell you the general principle, and then I give you a specific example again. So I prat uklal uprat. Why are you doing that? So when you see over here, when we talk about the concept of klal uprat, we're actually talking about a whole range of different things that could happen. Okay? I don't want to get very technical, but sometimes the Torah will give us a general principle and then an exception, a specific exception. Right? Kol davar shehoyo bichlal v'yatsa min haklal. Right? Something that was part of a general example, and then it was removed from the general example. Why was that done? Okay. So, but before we can unpack all of these various scenarios, we just have to try and understand. Just forget about what the Gemara says. Forget about what the Torah says. Just in our own logic, what do you think a person is trying to do when they add a detail, when they're speaking about a general principle? Forget where they add the detail. Just generally speaking.
To be clear.
Okay, so that's true, but it's a little bit generic. What does it mean to be clear? To show an exception. Okay, that's one possibility. It might be, but then I wouldn't say that's a prat. A prat means a detail of the klal. If I'm showing an exception, then I'm essentially talking about something which does not belong to the klal. So why would I use a specific example once I've
Show a law or a, I don't know, precedent, whatever.
precedent? Okay.
Guide your thinking of what it might be.
So that's what the Torah is trying to do clearly. Or a person is trying to. I'm trying to guide a person's thinking. Let's go back to the example of Shabbos. If I had to get up in front of a crowd who's never heard of Shabbos before and tell them that you may not work on Shabbos and leave it at that, this is so wide open, it is so undefined that it's completely useless. And by the way, a funny thing. Did what?
Isn't that what Torah does anyway? It's
Well,
just Shabbos.
well, not really, because it will add a prat. Okay, but we're going to get there. So where this is a little bit entertaining is you have people who read scriptures. I'm not necessarily Jewish people. Read scriptures, take it at face value. Not allowed to work on Shabbos. Not only carrots. I'm saying even people who live today in this country.
You've got different interpretations of Shabbos, from Chabad to...
And sorry, where do you get these interpretations from? Where do you get these interpretations from?
Shabbos, Shabbos. I don't roll on Shabbos.
I'm saying, where do you get these interpretations? From these principles. So, if the Torah were to say, just blankly, don't work on Shabbos, you would have your version of work, you'd have your version of work, you'd have your version of work. So for one person it means that, for me, it's relaxing to do the garden. It's not work. It's recreation. For another person, they'll say, work. Basically, for me, work is walking, so I'm not going to shul. So you have to fine-tune. First, you've got to teach the principle. The principle is that this is the day of rest, and Hashem rested on the seventh day, etc., etc. So you give the high level, thou shalt not work on Shabbos, lo yisaseh melacha, and then you're going to give a prat. You're going to give some kind of an example, because that will help to focus our thinking, and that will help us to define what it is that we're talking about.
No,
Yeah.
but it seems like inconsistent when it does that though. Like why would it choose that as opposed to other very general wayward principles like don't cook a kid in his mother's milk?
Okay, good. So
Why does it not guide your thinking there?
So good. That's a really important question, and the answer to that question is going to be that what the Torah wants to do with this particular prat is to give us a category where there may well be other categories. Now, in the case of do not cook a kid in its mother's milk, we've got the opposite. There, it's given us a very specific example. We have to work out how we broadened the category in the way that we did. That's not going to be cloud of prat. It's going to be a different methodology, but when, for example, the Torah tells us that you tishbois, that 6 days your work should be done on the 7th day. Sorry, Shabbos and Yilochem. The 7th day should be a day of rest. And then it says the next pasuk, you may not ignite a fire on Shabbos. So now the Gemara is going to say, why did you choose fire? Why is that the example? And it becomes a massive discussion in the laws of Shabbos what the purpose of that example of fire was. But the principle, even before we get there, the principle is if you go klal uprat, so this is the only one I think we're going to manage time-wise tonight. If you go klal uprat, if you start with a general rule and then you give a specific example, then we say ein bechlal ela ma shebefrat. Then what we've done is we've completely limited this generic law to things that are like the example. Okay? So, what would be an example? Now we can get to Chalam's favorite. What does the pasuk say?
Very, very
The pasuk says that if a person wants to bring a sacrifice, what do they bring? Right? It says, Adam mikem ki yakriv korban Hashem. A person will bring a korban. Klal. That's a general principle. Bring a korban. Bring a sacrifice. Doesn't tell us what the sacrifice is. You want to bring an elephant? Bring an elephant. Right? So the pasuk says, no. Mina behema, mina bakara, mina tzoin. Says specifically, only from these species of animals. So the general principle is there's a mitzvah of a korban, of taking an animal and sacrificing it to God. That's the klal. That's the general principle. The prat, there's only certain kinds of animals that are acceptable. So ein bichlal, there's nothing that fits this general principle, elo mashe befrat, other than what we specified. That's why we gave the general principle to teach you what you're supposed to be doing, which is to bring a sacrifice, and then we gave you the specific to tell you the only kosher way to do it. Okay, so that's an example. So you may not bring another kind of an animal, even if it's a kosher animal. You can't decide you're going to bring a buffalo as a korban. A giraffe as a korban, right?
Today's practice also be governing in shul because you can't take.
Yeah, but that's a technical point. That's not this klal prat. Right? This klal prat is the klal. The general principle is bring a korban. The prat is there's only one range of things that qualify as a korban. Now, before the Torah was given, that wasn't the case. Before the Torah was given, you wanted to bring a sacrifice to Hashem. Take whatever animal you had and bring it as a sacrifice to Hashem.
He's saying govern it, sure, but the only specific shores you can govern it.
But that would have to be a pasuk. That would have to be a pasuk, and here we're talking about what's actually written in a pasuk, and there's no concept of klal prat outside of extrapolating information from a pasuk. So we're talking specifically. The pasuk gives us a general principle, and then it goes into the specifics. Okay, the various other examples, we'll have to leave those for next time.